and welcome to episode 2 of the Geopolitical Review. In this series, I sit down with leading academics, experts, practitioners, and journalists to explore the issues shaping the world today. Few issues are more important than global politics, from rising tensions in the Middle East over the future of the Straits of Hormuz to Europe's search for alternative energy supplies and the growing strategic importance of Central Asia and the South Caucasus. Energy continues to shape international relations in profound ways. To help us navigate these complex challenges, I sit down with Rauf Mammadov. Rauf is a senior manager at Fuld & Company and a non-resident scholar on energy security at the Middle East Institute and Jamestown Foundation. His work and research focuses on energy security, global energy markets, and evolving relationships between the Middle East, Central Asia, and the South Caucasus, with a particular emphasis on the post-Soviet states of Eurasia. Before moving into research and analysis, Rauf spent a decade with the state oil company of the Azerbaijan Republic, where he held several senior administrative positions and established the company's US representative office in Washington, D.C. Alongside his work on energy policy, Rauf co-directs Bright Garden Voices, a grassroots initiative aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. So thank you for joining. If possible, could you give a brief introduction of how you got into your field and your area of expertise?
Yeah, so my original background is history and international relationship, but I also studied English here in the United States, and I used that skill to learn how to translate and interpret, which eventually got me into an oil and gas company as an interpreter. And once I was in the company, I fell in love with the industry. I was originally oil and gas, but then, I built on it to all the broader energy industry, such as renewables and the other adjacent industries. And then I supplemented that knowledge that I learned while working in this company with my master's degree here in the United States. So I learned the theory as well. So that's been 20 years since I've been doing this, and I really enjoy it and highly recommend it.
And if your field is in energy and energy interdependence, like you say, from all over the world, can you define what energy interdependence is and what that looks like in practice today?
So the key commodities within the energy, unfortunately, are the fossil fuels. And namely, these are the oil and gas. And when we talk about the energy independence, what we're really saying is how the oil and gas industry has become globalized. So what that means is the market has become interdependent. So whatever happens in some other parts of the world will have an impact on very far away from there. And I think the latest escalation in the Middle East, or previously in the 70s, where there were embargoes, oil embargoes, are a good example of how a closure in a strait very far from UK or the United States has direct impact on the gasoline that you fill or diesel that you fill in your tank here in the United States or in London or elsewhere in the UK. So that's a broad definition of it, but it could be very local as well. There's a concept, there's a notion of peace pipelines where, let's say that several countries are connected with a certain pipeline, and that pipeline, whether it's oil and gas, serves as a deterrent for escalation of conflict or something else. So it could be in a very broader. It could be explained in a very broader explanation, or very local as well. But I think what's happening is that gradually the world is becoming interdependent and globalized. generally per se, and the energy being a geopolitical commodity is an integral part of that process. So that creates the energy interdependence.
So, like you say, there's this idea that with increased globalization, increased energy interdependence, and connectivity, that there should be a reduction in conflict. Or a lot of theory would suggest that the more interdependent you get with another country, the less you are likely to go to war with them. What would you agree with that, or on the whole? Obviously, there are exceptions. We're seeing that at the moment, but what do you think determines whether it reduces conflict or where a state then decides to use energy as a strategic tool
Well,
against another
yeah,
state?
that's a great question. I think we have to look in the overall stats to see whether, as the world is globalized, the amount of conflicts are decreasing or not, or it will require more detailed research because some parts of the world are are still on the pariah and they're not um, affected by the energy commodities. They're not. Some parts of the world are not even integrated into the global market, such as Africa or parts of South America or parts of Asia, where we see the conflicts taking place. Uh, the overall, by logic, it has to serve as a deterrent. But we have seen in the history where the political consideration have superseded the energy consideration. And more recently, we've seen that in an example of the US Israel Iran war, where it was obvious that this will eventually lead to energy crisis. However, the decision maker, especially here in the Washington, D.C., has decided to take that risk. Now, it's too early to comment what drove that decision, whether it was a miscalculation or not. But in hindsight, as what we see at the moment is that Iran has successfully used its control over the strait or its impact over the passage through the strait to prevent further escalation or to prevent the United States and Israel to achieve their goals, ambiguous goals that they have set. So I think you know we may have had a very different situation when if and further escalation if Iran hasn't used this strait as a leverage.
Yeah. So this is the US Israeli Iran conflict that's going on at the moment, where Iran has closed the Straits of Hormuz, um, which carries about 20% of the world's oil consumption. Um, and this, I feel, it's interesting is because it's not necessarily who controls the oil, but who controls the transportation routes instead. And that has become a more powerful instrument rather than having the resource itself. So would you say that this is kind of a turning point now where it's more about who controls the choke points, and that those that do have more power than we initially thought before this conflict started?
Well, it has always been like that. The only difference is that it's more uh, we're seeing the impact of, of it. But if you're a student of energy, the way that I started actually at Johns Hopkins, one of the first actual papers that I've written was about the choke points, and one of the first concepts that they teach you here about why the United States and is the the most influential player or a country in the world, and why dollar is the currency that the global trade is built on, is because of U.S. Navy, and because U.S. Navy has a leverage over controlling these choke points. And it's the only navy in the world that has fleets in all the oceans. And we went through Bab al Mandab. We researched. I wrote a paper on Hormuz or the Malacca Strait. Now, we have to make some clarification when we talk about Iran's control over Hormuz, or why Iran used this leverage and why it has successfully used it, what enabled them to successfully use it. One can say that Iran could have exercised this power before the war as well, right? They had control over it. They had everything set up for, they say 30, 40 years. What enabled Iran to exercise the leverage was that, number one, Iran was on the receiving end of the aggression. So based on international law, the international community had no right to question their exercise of this leverage because it was for protection. That's one. Secondly, the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran was not based on multilateral international cooperation, as it was the case with Iraq or Afghanistan. Whether it was right or wrong, that's a different issue, but it was not multilateral. The partners in Europe or elsewhere in the world were not consulted with it. So that has deprived the United States, especially the United States, with that significant support or inevitable support that they had in Iraq or in Afghanistan war. So that's the difference between them. U.S. still is the strongest navy in the world. They're the only navy that has deep sea, what do we call a deep blue sea fleet. But the only difference is that in this, especially when it comes to the Hormuz, it cannot successfully exercise it because there is no international support. There is no full international support, both political and military support to exercise it.
Do you think, though, I found it interesting as well that one of the ways that Iran has succeeded so far against the US is because they have alternative military means that the US wasn't anticipating to be as successful as they were, like with drones and things like that. So is it also showing that the conventional military means that the US have relied on for decades don't work anymore in terms of
Well,
ensuring the
it's great
stability?
that. Well, I'm not a military expert. But I agree with you fully. And it's great that you brought that up because I'm also Azerbaijani, and Azerbaijan-Armenia war was the first full-scale war which brought up that issue that you've just mentioned, that whether the conventional warfare has become redundant because now you can use very cheap drones to inflict damage on multi-million-dollar assets of the opposing party. So I think yes, there's a strong element or factor that had to be taken into consideration. But my humble view is that this was a very very big miscalculation by the Trump administration. They thought, and I think it was built on that success that they've gained in Venezuela, that they can replicate the success in Iran as well. Now, history will show. I mean, again, I'm not a military expert. History will show whether that was true or not. But I think it was a miscalculation. I think the US administration thought that it will not come to a point where Iran will be able to use its leverage over the Hormuz Strait, because everything will be done by that time. And it seems like they were wrong. And it seems like it was a very poor decision making based on I guess hype of Venezuela. But I agree with you 100% that the paradigm shift
Conventional
in
military.
yeah,
Yeah.
a paradigm shift in conventional military, it needs to be researched. I mean, throughout the war, I had we call them the OSINT, right? The guys who are the military experts. Who they approached me. Some of them are PhD. They approached me, asked me so many questions about the war when the Azerbaijani Armenia war going on, and I asked them the counter question. They said that it's something new. Of course, there were some faint signals of it in Syria, when Turkey was again using these drones against the Syrian army. But in terms of the full scale war, this was the first time where these tanks became obsolete, because now um, you can damage these tanks with very cheap drones, and these tanks are super expensive and powerful. And then Ukrainian war was, I think, is a great example of actually how they've
Yeah.
taken it to another level. And I think Iranians have learned from the both Azerbaijani Armenia war and also Ukraine war as well, and I think that's what made it impossible to do the ground invasion in Kharg Island that they were speculating about.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting as well how Ukraine are building relations with the Gulf states about exchanging technology and drones like that as well. But I just to go back to energy, I know that this is a bit of a huge question, um, because we don't know how this conflict is going to end. But in terms of the medium to long term consequences of what this market disruption will do, a lot of people are suggesting that actually what we're experiencing now isn't even going to be the worst part economically of this conflict, and that will come even if the war was to end tomorrow. So I think the EU said that they're spending 430 million euros a day in additional costs during the conflict with Iran. But one third of global seaborne fertilizer passes through the Straits of Hormuz as well. So, what do you think will be the consequences of this conflict, medium to long term? How will that shape the energy market in the future?
Well, again, it will depend on how fast the things will go back to normal, the new normal, I guess. That's one. But as you have correctly mentioned, there's been um, supply deficits, not only in oil and gas, but also in derivatives, refined products, or fertilizers, engine oils, and the others. I think we will see the impact of it within a month or so, whether um, the commercial reserves, again, if the war ends within a week or so, if the commercial reserves will have been depleted, and because at the moment we're basically those commercial reserves or strategic reserves of the oil or gas or refined products are the are serve as a buffer for the price spike. If it wasn't for them, the impact on the price would have been higher. I think there's a there's a there's a talk about that oil prices have to be around $150 or $200 at the moment. Um, uh, and that's one. Secondly, the we have to also consider that the war started when the global economy was going through hardships anyway. So there was inflation going on, anyway. So it just uh, exacerbated the situation. So it didn't happen in vacuum. It's not like everything was great and then this war happened and then oil prices skyrocketed. So that adds up as well. Um, the In terms of the energy industry, we are already seeing the impacts within the energy industry. We're seeing exporters such as UAE finding alternative pathways to Hormuz. Apparently, they have been building the pipeline to bypass Hormuz, and today they announced that it will be ready in 2027. Or we saw in case of Saudi Arabia redirecting the oil through their east-west pipeline and accessing the Red Sea and exporting through there. Um, so and then you know again, it's not directly involved or directly related to this war, but it was, I think it was a nail on the head when the UAE announced that they are leaving OPEC. So I think there's direct and indirect impacts of the war, which will change the dynamics within the oil industry. Like OPEC or OPEC plus, the way that we know it now, uh, will lose significantly its leverage on the oil prices, given that one of the most important political and um, volume-wise important players within the cartel has decided to leave. Whether it was related to this war or whether it was related to their rift with Saudi Arabia, or whether all of these were interconnected, it's a very broader issue to discuss. But I think there will be immediate impacts on it. And then in a broader perspective, I think we will see these oil and gas exporters trying to find alternative export routes, safer export routes. We will probably see, we're already seeing that Saudi Arabia and Turkey yesterday have signed an agreement to build a train from Saudi Arabia, from Hijaz to East Mediterranean. We may see the same things happening in oil and gas exports as well, because as the Gulf has lost its trust in the United States in terms of their protection, they understand that they have to rely on the coalition or coalition of what they now call the middle power. So we also see as a, again, not as a direct result or outcome of it, but as a result of a long-going process where we see middle countries or middle powers are creating alliances and creating poles on their own. And, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey is one of them. It could be India, Israel, and the US, another one. So we will see a lot of alliances being created, and that will have a direct impact on oil and gas as well. Qatar, one of the largest LNG exporters in the world, I think the largest LNG exporter in the world, was hurt probably the most. So there's a possibility that, given the great relationship with Turkey, Qatar may want to build a pipeline and then access East Mediterranean as well. So we will see some logistical consequences of this war. We'll see some political consequences, as in form of alliances. And I think the matter of choke points, the bottlenecks will again come to the fore of the issue, because today we're talking about Hormuz. There's another important one, Malacca, in the Southeast Asia, which no one is talking about. But there may be a conflict going brewing there as well, with China, United States, Taiwan, and the other issues, or the Southeast. So it could be a preview of what happened here, and I think the policymakers and researchers will put extensive research in this, trying to understand how not to prevent this from happening in Malacca or other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. I do think, particularly with the second Trump administration, I mean, I don't think that the the Gulf states were expecting that their major ally was going to cause this kind of disruption in the region, and that actually one of the reasons why they're being targeted is because of that alliance that they have or had with the United States. So it sounds like what you're saying is that a major result of this conflict will be the diversification or of energy networks or of political allegiances and things like that. Do you see the South Caucasus benefiting from this conflict or emerging as a more significant alternative energy corridor between Europe and Asia?
Yeah, that's a great question. It certainly fits into the narrative of that middle corridor, which especially Azerbaijan has been trying to push for a long time. Um, so the way that and I worked for the state oil company of Azerbaijan, so I was part of that narrative in the beginning. The way that Azerbaijan positions itself is that from Arctic Sea to the Gulf to the Persian Gulf, there are only in that narrow part of the world, there are only three countries. It's Russia, Azerbaijan, or South Caucasus, and Iran. And it's
Mm-hmm.
only South Caucasus or that corridor that has helped the West or US and Europe in their war against the terrorism in Africa, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or it's actually the most importantly, it's the only part of the world, especially Azerbaijan is the only country among these, three energy exporters who are not using um, their resources as a bargaining chip or as a leverage. Uh, what the Russians called energy diplomacy against EU, and they're actually contributing to the energy security of EU. And then EU is on paper at least it's the most important ally of the United States, the transatlantic partnership. So it's actually contributing to the energy security of Europe. So it when the disruptions take place in Hormuz, that fits perfectly in their narrative. And they've been trying to build that narrative for quite a long time. And the reason because of that, actually, especially because of Azerbaijan, is that Azerbaijan's economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas, and they've failed to diversify their economy, and their only hope is profiting from that transit. That's their lifeline. It's not a luxury, actually. It's not a political ingenuity. It's life. That's the only option they have. So that's why they're heavily invested in it. And I think it fit perfectly into the war. I don't want to call it Schadenfreude because they also benefited from the high rising oil prices too. Azerbaijani oil is a very good quality light oil, and it was sold around $60 before the war. At certain point of time, they were selling it for $160. So it's a great um, boost to the budget revenues, and the same applies to the gas as well. And I see more activization of pro-government and the government resources trying to push this narrative more and more. So yeah, I think in a short-term perspective, the South Caucasus countries will benefit from it, given if, of course, contingent whether the peace will remain in the region. That's first, and secondly, there will be more and more support by the United States and Europe into the investment, but it will also depend on democratic situation in the region and or attitude of EU and the United States towards these processes. So it's a very complicated part of the world. But in terms of the logistics, in terms of the transportation routes, all three countries are equally interested, not equally invested, I guess. I see Azerbaijan is more invested and becoming a leader in this process. So yeah, as long as this war or escalation remains here, and then as long as there is no agreement with Russia on restoring the relationship with Russia, the middle corridor um, will maintain its status as a reliable option.
So do you think, if we're talking about the region specifically, that negotiations between the states and the South Caucasus on pipelines and transport and things, particularly between Armenia and Azerbaijan, do you think that energy connectivity can act as a bridge to peace in this region? Or is it just separate from the peace, or it's managing the conflict without resolving underlying causes, if that makes sense?
So the Georgian War was a good example when Russia had pipelines, or Russia was actually supplying gas to Georgia. I'm talking about the Georgian War of 2008. And then Russia using Georgian territory to supply gas to Armenia was a good example when it actually prevented the escalation from taking place, right? There was a full-fledged war. It was short-lived, but there was a war. So I don't think these pipelines can prevent the escalation from happening, but they could be valued as a part of bigger uh, and growing relationship between these two countries. So on a standalone basis, they cannot be a deterrent to an escalation, but they can contribute to overall what they call unfreezing of the relationship between these two countries and building more interconnection, not only in the energy but the other spheres as well. But I don't think it it can bring peace, as some of the commentators claim. It can bring peace on a standalone basis. Another example is the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar escalation a few years back. Of course, never translated, fortunately, into military escalation, but there was, they breached all their relationship between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and there was like a blockade of Saudi Arabia, if you remember, on Qatar. But at the same time, the gas was flowing from Qatar to Saudi Arabia through pipeline, and it didn't have any impact on the pipeline. So it shows that sometimes these countries can compartmentalize their relationship. Maybe on political level there could be some escalation, but when it comes to the gas, oil, since it could be a lifeline for them, for their economy, just keep separate from them. So that can be a case as well, or maybe there could be disruption. So I think that my answer to it is that it can be an important factor, but as a standalone tool, as a deterrent, as like nuclear weapon, it's not as as it's been portrayed.
And you just mentioned Russia, obviously, intervened in Georgia in 2008, and has been a major player in conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. Can you expand a little bit on what their influence has been like since 2022 in the region and since then? Have they remained a major player there, or have they withdrawn because of their conflict in Ukraine?
You mean 2022, probably?
Yeah, 2022. Yeah.
2020 and then 23. Yeah, I think since the Ukrainian war, and then since the Azerbaijan-Armenian war, there's been significant change in Russia's influence in the region for different reasons. First of all, Russia was heavily distracted by the Ukraine war, both politically and economically, and that played a huge role. That's number one. Secondly, the political processes taking place in Georgia and especially in Armenia played a role as well. In Armenia becoming a democracy and Russia losing that influence in Armenia, not fully, but at least politically, losing their influence in Armenia played a role as well. And then the war happened, and Russia chose not to interfere, which was logically leveraged by Armenian leadership, saying that we're part of the both military and economic alliance with Russia, and we didn't see any help from this. So that created a rift between the Armenian and Russian leadership. Yeah, Russia, there were the political processes within Armenia that has had an impact on Russia's influence. Armenia becoming democratic and pluralist had a certain effect on it. And then the war and the Russia-Ukraine war was a big distract for Russia, because they were heavily militarily and politically invested in, and they are still facing blockades, economic blockades, and sanctions. Um, and then there were some minor incidents. I mean, not minor, major incidents with Azerbaijan, with the downing of the plane over Chechnya, and then an escalation of the relationship between Azerbaijan. So we see that there's been decrease in their influence, certainly, and then increasing, slowly but steadily increase of influence of Turkey in the region. But to say that Russia has been fully removed from the region, it's not right. Let's come to the Georgia again. They're still heavily influencing Georgian domestic politics. The ruling party is not anti-Russian, least to say. I don't want to comment more on that. In Armenia, economically, Armenia is still part of Russia-led economic and military union alliances. That's first. Russia is economically has very strong influence. Russia still supplies most of the gas to Armenia. They still supply most of electricity in Armenia, because Metsamor, the nuclear facility that they have, is Soviet built, and it's managed by Rosatom, the Russian state-owned nuclear company. And then they have other big assets, Russia-led big assets there as well. So it will be difficult to divorce Russia and to leave those unions for Armenia. But if you compare it to pre-2022 or pre-2020, pre-COVID influence, of course, we see diminished influence of Russia in the region. But Russia will always be there, as Iran will always be there, and Turkey will always be there, and these countries being part of these empires throughout the history. Although Azerbaijan was never part of the Ottoman Empire, but Russian and Persian Empire, and they have a very recent history of how things can go from good to bad, or from bad to worse. And the Ukraine conflict is a good example of it as well. When someone asks me, I always say that it's only 2-hour tank drive from Russian-Azerbaijani border to Baku. From Dagestan to Baku, and the policymakers in Baku, and as well as in Tbilisi and Yerevan, understand that threat. So they have to deal with these powers. United States, one administration can be favorable towards the region, another administration may not. And then it could be like 180-degree in change, but Russia will always be there, and Iran will always be there. And anything happens inadvertently has an impact on this country, on the economies of these countries. And then, I think I forgot to mention this, which is very important. The remittances. There's a big population, Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Georgian population living in Russia, and Russia has shown that once they want to, every time there's an escalation in the relationship or a hint of escalation in the relationship, they start sending people back, or you know, or creating difficulties for the nationalities of these countries, which has huge impact on the, not as for instance Tajikistan, which is budget is like 48% dependent on remittances from Russia, but it's still a big deal. And imagine 2 million people coming back to Azerbaijan, whose economy is not in good shape anyways, or in Georgia or any country. 2 million people coming back in a very short period of time is a big impact on the economy. So, as yes, the influence has decreased, but Russia understands whatever the factors that I've mentioned. Russia is well aware of these factors, and these are legit influence levers to use. I'm not even talking about the other military, political, and other impacts, cultural, historic, and they're being very careful. So it will be interesting to see what happens after the Ukraine war or after the Iranian war, and then if the economic sanctions are relieved, and it will be interesting to see the trajectory of the relationship. And I think the policymakers in all three capitals understand that these wars are temporary, and they have to look beyond these wars and see how this relationship evolve.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask as well about China. I know that they're not necessarily a major investor, or they're not as big an investor as, like you say, Turkey are. Um, but they have also spent years building substantial strategic energy reserves for moments like this. Are we entering an era where energy security isn't about your access to resources, but about your resilience to disruption? And is that then where Europe has gone wrong in not anticipating that they need to be more resilient? Because we we realized when the war in Ukraine started how dependent we were on Russian energy reserves, or on Russian energy. So we reduced that, but we didn't seem to look or evaluate anywhere else how dependent we were on them. So is it that greater attention has to be paid to resilience rather than about your access to resources?
Yes. The So let me answer the second part of the question about the EU. And throughout this pre-Russia Ukraine conflict, I was heavily involved in trying to convince the US government or policymakers here, by writing articles, by involving in briefings to the congressmen, by talking to people, and also in the EU as well, um, on on the very issues that you have just mentioned, that EU is not ready. And what I understood is that one of the main challenges that we were facing is that European Union was not really a united union. It was
Mm-hmm.
divided between Berlin and Brussels. And Berlin played an enormous role in convincing Europe, United States, and others that Russia is not a threat. And then, also by taking that still unfathomable decision to close all their nuclear facilities. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not for nuclear power per se, but doing it at that time of period where this conflict was becoming inevitable for whatever reasons that we don't want to go into that, but it was the process, the die was cast, we have already passed the Rubicon. We were heading towards that. Making that decision and, becoming heavily dependent on Russian gas, I think it went against the interest of the European Union. And what we're facing at this moment is a good example of what awaited us. Now, that's first part of the question. I think the main problem was that EU was not united in their decision. The secondly, what the policymakers in EU, I think, got wrong about was the renewable energy. Their understanding of renewable energy, or getting away from the fossil fuels, they thought that would bring sovereignty, but I think they conflated decentralization, which is what the renewable power is, right? You're not dependent on grid, you're not depending on one source, with energy sovereignty. Now I'll elaborate. Now, renewable power, the main problem with the renewable power, which may decrease dependence on fossil fuels, is that it's not as reliable as the fossil fuels. It doesn't provide 100%. It's intermittent, right? You can't rely on it 100%. And second problem is that they're it's not, the technologies are not competitive with oil and gas technologies. They're super expensive. Besides solar and onshore wind, but these were not the technologies that they were talking about. They were pushing hydrogen, fuel cells, very complex technologies, which are, I'm in this business. I consult commercial companies. It's nowhere close to solar, wind, or oil and gas. It's super expensive. And then the third thing, especially when they were promoting the EVs and the others, again they say, okay, EVs will decrease our dependence on oil and gas, but then EVs are depending on critical minerals, and the critical minerals are rare earth minerals are also coming from, not from Europe, right? Mainly actually from outside of the Europe. In terms of the sources, like rare earth elements like cobalt comes from Congo, but almost 98% of, or maybe 80-90% of it is refined or processed in China, and that applies to others as well. So China, actually, I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, has saw the game before, and they have invested heavily in these technologies. Now, anything you look at is, I wrote a piece lately about the exponential growth in demand for the data centers, and there are two solutions to it, because they cannot depend on grid, right? The power grid, because power grid is overcrowded. It's either the gas turbines or battery electric storage systems. Guess what? All of them are 80-90% dependent on either rare earth elements or technologies coming from China. So I think, yes, Europe wasn't ready for that, and China understood that beforehand. And I do agree that they have created the resilience. Of course, they're not 100% resilient, but they're more resilient than Europe. The United States is trying, understood that late in hindsight, and they're trying to use their political power and correct that mistake by investing by building relationship with the countries that are have those rare earth element deposits, like Central Asia or or the other parts of the world. But that China has started doing it way before than the Europe and the United States done. In terms of whether dependent on what this disruption showed, I mean, I think it was always the case that what if you're one of the first lessons that they teach you in the oil and gas company is that even before investing in a gas field, especially in the natural gas field, you have to build the pipeline. You have to invest in the export facility. Actually, I remember we had a $40 billion project, which of like $25-30 billion was the exploration and production, or maybe half and half. And then rest was the pipeline and export infrastructure. We actually had to build a pipeline, or to make a decision to build a pipeline and sell the gas, which we didn't have, to the buyers in Europe before we made a final investment decision in the field. So logistics has always been, at least in the energy industry, has always been the most important thing, especially in the natural gas, which is not easy to transport. With the oil, you can put it in the tankers, you can put it in the barrels, you can put it in anything. But with the gas, there are only two options. It's either LNG terminal, which is super expensive, or the pipelines. There's no other options. You can't put gas in a train and then transport it, which you can do with diesel and oil. So uh, I think my answer to you is that yes, but the energy industry knew this well before. It's the political audience or normal audience who don't know this industry have come to a realization that, oh my God, this is actually a real issue. The logistics are the real issue.
Yeah, I'm based in Scotland, and they are planning on building an AI data center in a tiny little village down the road from me that's going to be, I think it's twice the size of the village. And so there's ongoing debate about where they're going to get all the energy from, but they said that it's only going to use the equivalent of 280 houses, like 280 houses annual water usage, apparently.
It's not, I mean, you're saying it's big. It's not, I mean, good luck with the noise and pollution and the other,
Yeah,
because those things
yeah.
are, I mean, I think that's another issue. That's a whole different topic, and how
Mm.
insatiable that demand is, and the world hasn't. I'll give you one. I think that can be like in the when I become part of this energy industry. One thing that I understand that, and maybe it applies to the other industries as well. One, the general population is not aware of what's going on in the energy industry and how direct impact it can have on their lives. Secondly, and which is very, very, very disappointing, is that mainstream media and now even the social media are either wittingly or unwittingly, deliberately misleading the population about what's going on. They're using it for politics, and I think that's one of the main reasons that people are come to an acknowledgement very late. We knew about these problems long. We knew about the choke points. We knew about the Hormuz. We knew about the now. Like one thing that really concerns me: how are they going to meet the demand for these data centers? The 70% of all internet traffic is going to run next town where I live. I live right outside of DC. The world internet traffic, the global internet traffic I'm talking about. So the amount of data centers they're going to build is unbelievable, and there is no grid. There's nothing. I don't know how they're going to do it. And then the impact on the energy prices, it will increase. Like we have one electric car and one gasoline car, like ICE internal combustion engine. And every time I look at the EV consumption, and we charge it at home, which has to be a lot of cheaper because it's subsidized. It's going up and up. It like doesn't make sense to drive that electric car anymore. And the next thing you know, they're gonna bring back the coal production to meet that demand.
Yeah.
So, well, world is going. It's like it's a contrast. Is that AI? It's equated to the progress to artificial intelligence, and at the same time, you're using coal to meet that the energy demand. It's like going back
Yeah.
fossil fuels.
Two very different worlds meeting,
Yeah,
that's for sure.
that's a great topic actually for an article. But this was a great
Yeah,
talk.
no
Thank you
worries.
so much.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining
Grace.
me.
All
So,
right.
thank you for your
All
time.
right. Bye.